population of female ex-combatants. Our first phase was focused on ex-combatants who were in Buduburam who wanted to return to Liberia. And there are many steps to the reintegration of people into community, from sensitization of the community, preparation of the young men and women returning, to sensitization and preparation of the community for their return, and then their reintegration. And there are many smaller steps to that. So having done that in the first phase, what we learned a lot about was the significant marginalization of female ex-combatants who both during the war and afterwards, during the war served in a variety of capacities, from actively fighting and conducting all the acts that other soldiers in the war did, to also serving as sex slaves, as bushwives as they would call sometimes, to some of the chiefs. Doing some strategic planning and thinking for their forces. So they served a variety of roles, but what happened in the demobilization was that there were almost no services for the women. So they went through very little, and over the period of the last few years since the war, many of them have, clearly there's a lot of literature to support that, and our experience there certainly was supporting that perception, that the women's marginalization was something that has not been addressed at all. So we are now currently in a project in Bomi County, which is only about an hour away from Monrovia, and in a small town called Ba, and working with women, with the whole community. And the town of Ba is sort of surrounded by this plantation called Sime Darby. It's a rubber plantation, and that particular rubber plantation is a refuge for many of the ex-combatants, particularly many of the women also there, and they live on the fringes of this community. And so our work is focused on bringing them to some level of integration. So the people helping us doing that are our country partners. And one of our primary country partners has been the National Ex-Combatants Peacebuilding Initiative. This is an organization started by a group of 3 men who served during the war. It's a lovely story. They met in the hospital, they were injured, and had this moment of pretty significant connection, and decided that what they wanted to do really was to become peace builders and to change from what they had been doing to becoming peace builders. So they started the National Ex-Combatants Peacebuilding Initiative, and they have been our primary country partner. This time, however, they decided, well, it wasn't a surprise, but what they decided was that they would do this in collaboration with 4 other organizations. And those 4 form a consortium through which we work in this particular project. Want to continue? So, I'm sorry?
What groups were those?
PBRC,
which is Peacebuilding Resource Center, and Ford, Foundation for Human Rights and Democracy, and Receive. God knows what that
we
is.
never remember. It's an acronym for something. B.B. Coley runs it.
And some independent consultants as well.
So this portion, come on in. So this portion includes not just the work in the community, but clearly we've identified that capacity building and support for organizational, relational, fiscal functioning is a part of our intervention also. So we have asked for some assistance in that regard, and so we're doing some work at also helping them figure out how to send proper financial reports, how to create these things, and how to clearly develop an understanding amongst themselves about roles and responsibilities. Okay? So that's the background. Any questions about that? So the last trip we took is the basis for the scenarios that we want to talk to you about. What we'd like to do is present 3 different situations and then have you all break up into groups to respond to a set of questions and come back. It's 10 after 2. So come back probably at about 2:40, 2:35, and then share it in the large group. Okay? Does that make sense? Great. Can we start with-
So what we'll each do is present one of the issues to you, and then you can choose which one is of most interest for you to work together in a small group. Okay? So, do you want to talk about who's doing women's? You're doing it.
I'm doing the women.
Anna's doing the women.
You're doing
Doing
women.
child's dinner.
Okay, so why don't we go in sequence?
Okay. So as I said, the project is about the reintegration of female ex-combatants. So one silly assumption we had, speaking of assumptions we go into the country with, was that the focus on women would mean the staffing would be significantly by women. So we go there and have our first meeting, and there's an informal meeting at which we have asked for the list of participants of the training. Oh, the first part of this is dialogue training. We were training all the members of the consortium in the Public Conversations Project model of dialogue. And so those who were participating in the dialogue were the ones who would go in the community and facilitate the dialogues between the community members as a part of the activities related to the integration. So both in relation to the dialogue facilitation as well as staffing in the community, we wanted to know who were the list of participants, who the staffing, how they were thinking about the staffing, because part of our partnership and collaboration also meant that we were working side by side in many different ways, including in how decisions were getting made, so that we were doing a lot of that in consultation, which I will say, on a minor note, was a significant difference for them, because in the beginning they tend to see anyone who comes from outside as donors and as people telling them what to do. So shifting to the much more collaborative, elicitive model that has been the one that we have held to as NDB's principles was a really big shift for them. And it continues to be one that we have to pay attention to. So yes.
So how did you, because that is such a gap from where they are at, where did you find help to actually, because you can say the words, but so I'm just wondering what you found really gave that roots.
Doing it over and over and over and over again.
And
reinforcing.
That's such a great question, because that's actually what you're going to get to do in just a minute. So maybe if you
And we can
talk about how we started to do that, and
So when we asked for a list of the participants, what we found, then there were supposed to be about 20.
25.
25, okay. They insisted. There were 4 women on the list. And then again, in the course of the series of meetings over the next couple of days with the consortium members, the kinds of issues that came up were, so how many women should we have? Do we really need this many women in this project? Why is it that important? Why can't a man lead the team?
how many spaces are reserved for a man?
How many spaces are reserved for men? Those were the kind of questions that came up. And so that is one scenario that we want you to take away. So you're going in there as facilitators, as collaborative partners to help the consortium work on a project that's focused on women. What assumptions do you have about it? What do you want them to do? How do you facilitate a process that will serve the project, which is really our ultimate goal. So that's one scenario.
So after we've sketched out the 3, you might want to work on that. What do you do if you're faced with the partners think differently about women's involvement than you do? Okay? Second choice I'll present to you. So the next thing we need to do, of course, is choose the location. For us, the most significant part of choosing the location is, are there people in opposition, people who have a divide that we can bring together in joint activities of various kinds so that they can come to find each other as more understandable, more trustworthy, less the other, and more like them. So when we were funded, we called and emailed the partners and said, what do you think are some locations we should check out for that? They said, absolutely Bomi County. That's where we want to go. So, okay. So then, within Bomi County, they conducted an exercise that they call mapping. Some of you may know it, some may not. But the idea of going out into the community and doing a lot of interviews to determine what are the sources of conflict, what's the level of psychosocial functioning, how do people feel about each other, what conflict mechanisms do they already use, those kinds of things. That helps inform you about how the functioning is and who can benefit the most. So the partners did the mapping, and we scheduled a trip that was going to be based on that mapping. Had a due date, they chose the due date came and went. Reminders, communications, reminders and more communications, reminders and more communications. 3 days before we get on a plane, no data. The day we get on the plane, data. Cool. We're reading the data on the plane. The data says, no problems here. We've been living side by side for 30 years. We've actually got most of that stuff worked out, says the data. And by the way, it's county-wide data. It's completely aggregated when we were looking for a location within the county.
And we'd actually kind of highlighted 4 potential sub-areas. So if we had had the data saying from any, segregated by area, then we could have said, oh, it looks like we should be going here.
Indeed. So you're on the plane, about to start your project for which you're accountable to a funder, and this is the information you have. That's a problem that some of you might want to work on this afternoon when we break up. Or,
so the third one is actually something that's much more, to some extent, of an internal issue. And this is actually a conversation that we had on our first trip in November, what I'm going to relate to you, and I'll tell you what happened on our second trip. But during the course of our first trip, as we headed up to Bomi County, we were talking with our host country partners, including 2 people, one of whom is in a senior leadership position at the National Ex-Combatants Peace Building Initiative, one of whom is a line staff person there. In the course of the conversation, we started talking about the upcoming election and what do they think about the different candidates. And there is currently the president of the country is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She was elected in 2006, I think. So she's finishing a 5-year term, and there will be an election. There are going to be a number of other candidates, including one, Prince Johnson, who is widely referred to as a warlord. He's a senator right now, serving in the Senate. And in the course of talking about this, both our partners start talking about how, well, Ellen's not bad, but the country really needs a firm leader. And we end up kind of following that up and hearing about what a wonderful leader Charles Taylor was, and how different he was, for example, from Prince Johnson and Ellen, because he was very decisive. He had firm control of the situation. He wasn't like Prince Johnson, who is a psychopath and crazy, and then they related a story that absolutely confirmed that Prince Johnson is a psychopath and a very frightening, evil person. And in the relating of that story, one of our partners got very emotional, was very upset, and then they started talking about how clearly he's evil and he committed all these atrocities, and contrasted him with Charles Taylor, who was a model of discipline because he, publicly whipped his son for having done something that was not okay. So that shows that he is a firm man. Now, some of his followers he might not have always had them under control, which is the reason that he's up before the World Court right now, being tried for war crimes. But he was the kind of person that the country needed because he really communicated to people effectively, and so this conversation went on, and the net result was that for us, there was this sense of, oh my God, it's one thing to read in a book, or I'll speak for myself, not for us. For me, it was a sense of, yeah, I can read all this stuff in The Economist or in books or whatever. I'm now sitting next to someone who thinks that Charles Taylor is a hero, and that Liberia would be a whole lot better